did not genuinely feel their mistakes, what would they do if a real incident occurred next time?
The prince stroked his chin in thought, then looked to Nightingale, proposing a punishment of confining them to their room, not allowing them to leave until they finished 3 sets of comprehensive exercises in mathematics and science.
Upon hearing this, Lightning seemed petrified. Nightingale couldn't help but inhale sharply, feeling that the punishment of 3 sets of comprehensive exercises in mathematics and science was truly horrifying.
Nonetheless, realizing it was her initial proposal, she couldn't retract it now and sternly nodded her head.
Sylvie, supporting a petrified and despondent little girl, left the office. After everyone had left, Nightingale spoke, expressing that she hadn't protected Roland properly. Roland shook his head, telling her that she did well. Why did the assassin choose to act in the meeting hall?
Because he understood that Roland had a witch protecting him, and this witch was extremely powerful. Without drawing her away, there was no chance whatsoever. The more arrangements made, the more flaws could be exposed, so in the end, he could only launch an attack with a small dagger. Nightingale replied that he had almost succeeded, nonetheless. Roland smiled, stating that it wasn't a success unless he killed him.
He looked at Nightingale and asked her, without her, what would he have done?
Patiently wait for an opportunity sufficient to launch a fatal attack. So long as someone was lurking in the castle, such an opportunity would always exist.
Therefore, Nightingale had protected him very well.
Roland did not console Nightingale, this was his genuine thought, which made her feel a warm surge from within, dispelling most of her originally uneasy self-blame.
Petrov returned to the office in the evening, revealing that the assassin was named Theo, a former guard of Duke Ryan.
According to Nightingale and Petrov's speculations, this assassination didn't seem to be executed in revenge for the Duke. Theo's residence had been sealed off, and Summer would use her abilities to ascertain the true reasons, thus, Spear was also called to the castle. Sitting on Maisie's back, Spear felt a bit uncomfortable, continuously saying, "Slow, slow."
Maisie, hearing the word slow, thought Spear thought it was too slow and so accelerated.
Only upon reaching the stronghold did Spear finally take a breath, clarifying that she meant to say a bit slower. In the evening, Roland arrived at Theo's residence, where the room was empty. Clearly, all evidence had been destroyed before the assassin acted. Summer then began to recreate the events of these past few nights. Spear subsequently linked Summer's and Maisie's magic power, and Summer, temporarily possessing ample magical power, began to backtrack through the detailed events of each night. Theo was sometimes seen sitting by the fireplace in deep thought, sometimes writing something, all of which was recorded in a drawing by Soraya. According to the passage of time, this time, a ring appeared on the table. Roland's voice sounded somewhat astonished as he urged Soraya to draw the ring. The ring was quickly drawn by the magic pen. It was about thumb-sized, the main body around gemstone shaped, engraved on both sides with the tower and spear emblem, a typical Grey Castle royal crest.
Nightingale questioned, was he one of Timothy's men?
Roland pondered for a while before shaking his head after a long pause, stating it was a token of Wimbledon III, that is, Roland's father. Everyone was taken aback, because they had heard that Wimbledon III had been killed by Gerald, the first prince of Grey Castle.
Roland recalled his father showing him the ring when he was a child.
His father told him that each gemstone represented a warrior loyal to the royal family, and the more gemstones, the more stable the throne of the Wimbledon line. Roland sighed. It seemed Theo was a hidden piece placed by Wimbledon III beside Duke Ryan to monitor the entire Western Territory's movements.
Ron asked why Theo would attack Roland.
Roland thought it was probably because Timothy found the list and passed down the assassination order.
For them, the emblem meant everything, they would carry out any order, no matter what it was.
Nightingale watched the scene. Theo stared at the ring for a long time, eventually throwing the ring into the fireplace with a somewhat disappointed yet slightly relieved expression. Perhaps in Theo's eyes, finishing this order also meant freedom. However, Roland, who had figured out the reason, did not show a relaxed expression but gazed seriously at the fireplace, and Theo did not take his eyes off it for a long time. During midnight, Nightingale quietly snuck into Roland's room. Nightingale hadn't visited Roland in the middle of the night for a long time, but today's assassination left her emotionally unsettled, and without Wendy and Anna, the castle also provided her with less restraint. Gazing at the sleeping prince, she stepped out of the mist, quietly walked to the side of the bed, and gently kissed his forehead. Then, she lay down beside Roland. When Roland got up from bed, it was already broad daylight. He thought he must have been exhausted from yesterday as his arm was still a bit sore. He saw a fried egg and 2 pancakes, along with a cup of tea, beside the table. Just like back in the border town, it was clearly prepared by Nightingale. Roland said thank you to Nightingale towards the empty lounge chair. Nightingale's figure gradually emerged. Roland smiled. Nightingale would always lie down if she could avoid sitting. With a flicker, she flipped and sat on the bed, saying she also liked it here. He smiled at Nightingale, saw that she was in a good mood, and asked if she had a good dream. Nightingale thought for a moment and then said that indeed, it was a nice dream. Today, he hoped Nightingale would stay by his side. Thinking back, if Timothy really got the list, perhaps there are other people who got the order too. These men were unwaveringly loyal to the royal family, brave and intelligent, as they should not be wasted on assassinations. Those people should be placed in more promising positions because they were all heroes of the country. Nightingale smiled and said, "As you wish, Your Highness." Roland opens the curtains, ready to first visit the mines and salt wells. Nightingale, Petrov, and Roland arrived at a mining area. The man leading them is named Denver. His family has lived around this mountain for generations. Moreover, one of his ancestors was the one who initially discovered this mine. He seems very proud of this mine. Even when facing the Prince of Grey Castle, he speaks eloquently. When asked why the mine has yet to be exploited, Denver replied that it was because the month of the demons had just ended, melted snow had entered the mountain and was flowing through it. The rate of water collection was too fast, so mining could only wait until the summer. Roland suggested that they should use several steam engines to help pump out the water, but Denver hadn't heard of such a thing. Roland smiled and said it was a machine that would allow the mines to operate in all 4 seasons, and Denver had much to learn in the future. Denver looked somewhat skeptical but didn't say anything. Roland didn't mind and began to move to the next inspection point. Perhaps Denver didn't expect the prince to prepare to leave immediately. He hurriedly stepped forward, took out a small wooden box from his arms and handed it forward, saying it was a small token from his family. Roland, intrigued, accepted the box and opened the lid. Inside lay 2 dazzling gems, the light from the torches causing them to refract a mingling of red and green, brilliant enough to almost dazzle the eye. He was momentarily stunned. None of Denver's words hit his ears, as his attention was entirely focused on the gems. Their gleam was all too familiar, and even with his lack of knowledge about minerals, he had heard of this kind of stone. There was another, more common name back on Earth, jasper. However, what excited him was not the gem itself. After a long while, the prince closed the wooden box and excitedly asked about the remnants dug out from the mine. Denver said all the waste was transported to the foot of the mountain. Denver didn't quite understand the implication of the prince's question and explained that they had carefully sifted through those minerals, which were either of too poor quality or had shattered during the mining process, making them unsuitable to be polished into gems. Roland smiled and shook his head, telling Denver that those things might actually be the real treasures. Denver was immediately stunned. Roland did not explain further, as in this era even steelmaking was already a tough challenge, let alone refining pure aluminum. The main component of jasper is aluminum oxide. Also, as a byproduct of bauxite, finding it is a strong indication that the area is rich in aluminum elements, and both the soil and rock can be used as raw materials for aluminum smelting. The uses of aluminum are vast. It has a low density, and corrosion resistant, and is an essential key material for future aviation technology. Airships and large-scale weapons could all be possible in the future. It seems that Roland's plans may need some adjustments. The ship slowly approached the pier, and Tilly stepped out of the cabin, seeing the pier was already full of witches coming to greet her. Molly was the first to pounce for a hug. Honey enviously declared she wanted a hug too.
Andrea also came for a hug, followed by the other witches. A burst of laughter erupted from the crowd, and seeing the sincere smiles on everyone's faces, Tilly felt the depression that had lingered in her heart for days also dissipate quite a bit. Regardless, this place is her home, a nation built by witches. Camilla, the manager, while Tilly was away, watched Tilly, who was surrounded by everyone, and smiled, saying she would report the situation to Tilly later. The witches were very interested in Border Town, and everyone asked a lot of questions. Tilly responded to everyone's questions and concerns until the witches saw large crates being unloaded, which also contained books. Molly curiously asked what these were. Only witches who had been to Border Town had seen these frightening yet familiar books. Tilly clapped her hands, asking everyone to quiet down momentarily, and announced that this was a gift from Prince Roland to everyone, including manuals for reading and writing, basic mathematics, and science. In simple terms, they were knowledge. Most witches looked puzzled, but Tilly said that this was the only shortcut for everyone to enhance their abilities. Thunder also arrived at the pier, noting that popularizing education is not an easy task to achieve. It requires a substantial investment of money and time, meaning the territory would temporarily lose part of its labor force, and it demands rulers to implement it for a long time. Tilly nodded in agreement, but the change it brought was impressive, not only for ordinary people but even more so for witches. This was something Tilly had witnessed in Border Town. Before going to the Western Territory, she had never imagined that a group of ordinary civilians could also exude such vitality and life. Thunder maintained his usual demeanor, his smile hearty and friendly as he asked Tilly if her trip to the Western Territory had resolved the troubles in her heart. Tilly, shaking her head, hadn't found the answers she sought. Roland, after all, had kept some secrets from Tilly. However, under the current circumstances, those matters seemed to become less significant. The witches discovered a giant panda plush toy in another box. To which Ashes disdainfully remarked that the prince knew how to please Tilly with such gifts. Though other witches looked somewhat envious hearing it was a gift by the prince. Tilly, with a slightly blushing face, told Camilla and Thunder to return to the office to discuss further. Upon returning to the office, the trio began to discuss the information brought back from Border Town. Thunder was utterly astounded when he saw the documents in hand, which contained not only intelligence on demons but also 400-year-old writings from witches and their history. Enthusiastically, Thunder exclaimed that Tilly's Western journey brought back more secrets than he had discovered in his entire life of adventuring. Tilly, intrigued, asked Thunder if he was not afraid. With his adventurous heart, Thunder naturally wasn't afraid but instead was inflamed with a burning desire for more exploration. His only thought now was to rush to Border Town to meet that very witch. Tilly was rather bemused. The primary purpose of heading to the Western Territory was to meet Agatha, not her own daughter. She didn't know whether to feel happy or sad for Lightning at this point. Thunder also shared his own discoveries. During his most recent voyage, he returned to the sea line, a cliff made of seawater that divided the sea surface into two planes, but ships could travel freely on it. Even more unbelievably, they witnessed the entire process of a tide rising. This time, the flow speed of the seawater gradually increased, finally rushing to a low point like falling over a cliff. If it hadn't been for Molly's slime servant protecting the ship, it would likely have been broken in half on the spot. They desperately turned the steering wheel. A strong wind blew at that moment, so the ship neither moved forward nor fell off the cliff. Only then did they discover the truth about the tides. Tilly commented that this simply defied logic. Thunder, preferring to trust his own eyes over conventional logic, noted that a couple of weeks later, the tide began to recede, in sync with the ebb and flow timing at the Shadow Isle. They theorized that the water did not vanish but flowed towards the Shadow Isle as if a gigantic hole in the seafloor was devouring the seawater. Of course, these were all Thunder's speculations. After all, no one had ever seen what the actual seabed looked like. But there was one thing he cared about deeply: why was the ocean they were in called the Vortex Sea? Tilly was taken aback when she heard this, and Thunder mysteriously smiled. This name had existed for hundreds of years. Even though ordinary people couldn't see any vortex, it didn't mean witches couldn't.
Only when Tilly mentioned the history and witches from 400 years ago did Thunder realize that this name might have been passed down from that era. Tilly nodded, thinking that Thunder made a good point, but they didn't have the ability to investigate further, and neither did the witches of the Slumbering Isle. However, Thunder mentioned he knew one witch who might. This witch was in the fjords and hadn't interacted with humans for a long time. She used to be a good friend of Thunder's adventure crew but bid farewell to the land after awakening as a witch. Her melodious singing could only be heard when fog arose. Tilly should have heard stories about her. Tilly immediately remembered this was the mermaid who guides and helps travelers. Though Thunder was uncertain whether he could get her assistance, perhaps he needed to ask for a favor from his old friend, Margaret. Thunder also asked Tilly to inquire about purchasing ships from Border Town. Those ships didn't require sails, which would be very useful to him. However, he hoped that Lightning wouldn't find out about this matter. Tilly nodded, understanding that Thunder didn't want Lightning to insist on adventuring together. In the city of Neverwinter, at the Changga District dock, 2 concrete ships have moored, and many people are queuing to board. Kay, looking at her 2 friends, asked why they were not staying. Why would they go to a foreign place? Tiger Claw says working in the border town pays more than here. He patted Snake Fong, saying that when they save enough money, they could even buy a bicycle. Snake Fong nodded in agreement, while Kay's gaze fixed on him. Snake Fong agreed with Tiger Claw to earn more in the border town, but his true intent was that it was closer to paper. Roland then gave some instructions to Petrov. Patting Petrov on the shoulder, Roland told him that after he left, the place would be handed over to him, advising him to do well because being the executive officer of the Changga district would not be his end. Petrov bowed, promising not to let His Highness down. Roland boarded the ship, giving the order to set sail. With the ship's horn echoing, it slowly left the shore, heading towards the border town. On the ship, Roland looked at the Changga district. With only 1 week left to the spring offensive, he was at ease with Axe handling the military. For now, the most important thing is agricultural production. As long as they have enough food, everything will be alright. Nightingale mentioned the seeds have improved by Leaf, and with the agriculture minister, the spring planting work will surely go smoothly. In addition to this, the spring offensive has the final highlight to look forward to. Returning to Border Town, Roland immediately headed to the Crimson Water River dockyard with Nightingale. Seeing Roland appear, Anna immediately waved to him. Anna reported her work to Roland. Some things hadn't gone smoothly. There were several troubles like the ship's hull deforming at the side, propeller leakage, the ship tilting to one side after welding the bridge, and the gun mount being unable to lock the cannon, but Anna had already solved them. Roland was quite surprised. Anna blossomed into a bright smile, then began explaining one by one where the problems arose, what caused them, and how she resolved them. The 2 of them looked at Anna, unable to speak for a long time. Anna was truly impressive. Anna asked Roland if the ship had a name. Anna said the First Army soldiers came to see the ship every few days, even vying to carve their names on the bridge. Roland suddenly remembered this matter. Although he had promised that the person with the best artillery skills could have a ship named after them, this ship was an exception. The name of the first warship not only represented the ship itself but also represented this class and type. He smiled while saying, "He can't give this honor to others, so let's call it the Roland, the first battleship of the Roland class." In a secret room, Tassa and his intelligence department were studying the latest information. The intelligence they collected wrote that the royal capital had dispatched a fleet of 500 people to block the Crimson Water River, including 4 warships and 200 fully armed guards. They believed that Timothy intended to block the trade route and cut off the supply of materials to the western region. Tassa was somewhat heavy-hearted. This was not good news. This message had to be reported to His Highness immediately. Just then, the sound of wings flapping came from the garden. A white falcon darted into the room. It was a message from His Highness. Tassa took off the note, unfolded it, and quickly scanned the contents of the secret message. His heart gave a violent thump. Then, he couldn't help but laugh. Although he knew that as an intelligence officer, he shouldn't let his expression show, the news was too surprising and he couldn't suppress the joy in his heart. Tassa told his subordinates that they didn't have to worry about this matter anymore. His Highness was going to solve this problem from its roots very soon.
Everyone was a bit puzzled, wondering what Tassa meant by solving the problem from its roots.
Tassa clenched his fist, telling everyone that His Highness's first army and the fleet have already set off, and their target is the royal capital. The moment to dethrone Timothy has arrived. Roland stood atop the Roland-class warship. Apart from the flagship named after him, the rest of the ships were slow and cumbersome cement vessels. But one day, he believed, he would have his very modern fleet. Nightingale adjusted the tresses of her hair that had been tousled by the wind. Noticing Roland's upbeat mood, she asked if he was excited about returning to his homeland soon. With a smile, Roland shook his head.
He had no intention of returning to the royal capital. The border town is his only home.
His joy came from the hope of swiftly quelling the disputes and ending all conflict within the Grey Castle.
Nightingale detected that Roland was only telling a half-truth.
Caught off guard, Roland almost forgot Nightingale could discern lies. Coughing a few times, he admitted that he was immensely proud of having constructed so many ships in such a short period, precisely just within the month of the demons.
Nightingale nodded, although this time it was a heartfelt confession. It did sound a tad boastful.
Roland blushed, explaining that was why he hesitated to tell the truth initially.
Nightingale chuckled lightly, stepping closer to assure him.
She wasn't upset with Roland. Unless it concerned her directly, she didn't mind him telling some small lies now and then. Turning her gaze forward, Nightingale softly thanked him.
Confused, Roland looked at Nightingale.
Slowly, she explained her gratitude. Under his leadership, whether common folks or witches, all would be able to live happily.
Although Nightingale always believed Roland would achieve this, she hadn't expected the day to come so soon. Roland took a deep breath, telling her they are not quite there yet.
He was aware that even if Timothy was overthrown, most of the nobles would resist and struggle desperately.
Fully unifying Greycastle might still take several years, perhaps way longer than what Nightingale had previously anticipated.
With a soft voice, she admitted she was actually worried if she'd live to witness the day. Roland playfully flicked Nightingale's forehead, admonishing her to not speak such nonsense.
Roland would never let Nightingale put herself in danger.
Rubbing her forehead, she argued that as a combat witch, she was naturally on the front lines. Changes come with a price, she added, revealing that from the moment she pledged herself to Roland, she was prepared for what might come.
Placing a hand on Nightingale's shoulder, Roland gently shook his head. He said he was sorry to disappoint Nightingale, while there would be a cost. But most of it will be paid by their enemies.
Besides, he continued with a touch of gratitude, he owes a great debt to all of them.
Nightingale looked puzzled.
With sincere emotion, Roland confessed, had he not met the witches, he might not have been so quick to take this step. Maybe, deep down, if this world lacked its wondrous magic, he'd still be in some barren border town, living a primitive life, constantly on edge. Looking up at him, Nightingale realized that every word Roland spoke was the unvarnished truth.
Suddenly, lightning and Maisie descended from the sky, landing beside Roland and Nightingale.
Lightning reported, 20 kilometers away, for single-masted ships are approaching. They have oars on both sides and look a lot like the hawk-headed ships mentioned in the intelligence reports.
Lightning piped up, saying but she didn't see any hawk-shaped statues.
Patting her head, Roland explained, the hawkhead probably refers to the ramming prow underwater. Telling Lightning continue to monitor them and stay safe. The young girl gazed up at the prince with teary eyes.
And asked, can she do one less set of exercises as punishment?
Roland chuckled, saying, if she promises not to dash around recklessly in the future, she can just do one set.
Lightning's eyes immediately brightened.
Without wasting a moment, she leaped up and soared back into the sky.
Nightingale commented, Roland shouldn't have done that.
Roland waved while saying rewards and punishments make lessons memorable. The two returned to the command room. The Rifle Battalion's commander, Brian, the First Army's commander, Axe, the Artillery Battalion's commander, Vainer, and Captain Kakusim stood by a table, awaiting Roland's strategy for their upcoming naval battle. Vainer was the first to voice his opinion. It's hard to hit a moving target with their cannons. He suggests that they get closer before firing. He promises if they are within 50 meters, every cannon from the battalion can capsize an enemy ship. Brian shook his head. Cannonballs consume a lot of gunpowder, and currently, only Miss Anna can produce it. He suggests that they wait for the enemy to approach and then use the side-mounted machine guns to turn them into sieves. Roland turned to Captain Kakusim, questioning what was the captain's take. After hesitating for a moment, Kakusim bluntly stated they should just ram into them. Both Brian and Vainer stared incredulously at Kakusim. Kakusim slowly says, the Roland is both larger and faster, and it's made of steel. A wooden ship might just fall apart upon impact. Even if it doesn't break apart, the flooding from the damage would incapacitate them. Upon hearing this tactic, an image involuntarily formed in Roland's mind. Both their ideas seemed aligned. He finally decided, let's do it. Roland gave the order. The flagship, the Roland, hoisted the flag of the city of Neverwinter and sounded its steam whistle. Full speed ahead. Eden was a newly appointed knight from the royal capital, leading one of the ships meant to blockade the Western Territory's trade routes. If successful, he'd not only amass a great fortune but also earn a promotion. What he didn't realize, however, was who he was truly up against. A lookout sailor yelled, "Activity up ahead." Eden moved to the bow of the ship, squinting into the distance. Far away, plumes of black smoke rose, as if something was burning in the water. He could faintly discern a gray silhouette approaching. Undoubtedly, it was a ship, but what struck him odd was the absence of any noticeable sails. The crew observed that the oncoming ship moved at an incredible speed. Eden noticed it too. Even if it was downstream, its speed was astonishingly fast. The other two hawk-headed ships had also spotted the incoming vessel. One of them began rapidly moving its side oars, seemingly eager to be the first to board this peculiar merchant ship. A sailor chuckled, "Those guys love hogging the glory. Wasn't the merchant ship they nabbed this morning enough for them?" The sailor then turned to Eden, asking if they should charge forward too. After pondering for a moment, Eden replied, "No rush. They should observe for now." As the approaching ship became clearer, Eden's eyes widened in disbelief. Not just him, gasps of astonishment echoed across the deck. A sailor atop the mast shouted, "My God, Captain, what is that thing?" A deep horn sounded, echoing past everyone. The approaching ship not only maintained its speed but also slightly altered its course, heading directly for the foremost hawk-headed ship. With no time to maneuver, the Roland rammed headlong into the unsuspecting belly of the hawk-headed ship. The sound of splintering wood echoed crisply in everyone's ears. The slender wooden warship, as if struck by a massive hammer, lurched heavily to one side. In mere moments, the ship began to fall apart and sink. Upon seeing the colossal gray ship shatter the hawk-headed ship without losing any momentum, Eden was stupefied. Even though he didn't recognize the flag, in his mind, only the rumored prince of the Western Territory, said to have fallen with the demons, could produce such a thing. Men on the deck sprang into action, some readying crossbows while others loaded their newest weapons. Escape was out of the question. Grinding his teeth, Eden ordered, "Hasten towards the shore." Realizing their speed was insufficient, he figured hugging the riverbank would be their only defense against the oncoming ram. With the surge of the waters and the sudden maneuver of the gray iron ship, the bent hawk-headed ship finally detached. The second hawk-headed ship desperately attempted to change its course, aiming to distance itself from the adversary. But the Grim Reaper's horn sounded again. The Roland, with its deafening roar and trailing thick black smoke, accelerated, heading straight for the ship closest to it. The second ship met the same fate. Under the pressure of the onrushing metal behemoth, the warship's side was forcibly plunged underwater. Those who could, jumped into the water to save themselves, while others not as fortunate screamed and tumbled across the tilting deck.
Eden was petrified, lost for words.
In mere moments, 2 hawk-headed ships had sunk, and the one under his command seemed destined to be next.
For a split second, he was ready to abandon the ship and flee.
But, by some stroke of luck, his gamble paid off. Observing that his ship was now entirely close to the shore, the enemy adjusted its course, pursuing the last retreating ship. Eden realized that even if he managed to escape and return to the royal capital alive, it would be of no avail. He had to defeat this rebel ship and present it to King Timothy as a badge of merit. He knew the ship might have been forged by demons, but its crew was human, just like them. He ordered everyone to raise their bows and firearms, preparing to board and overpower those within the iron ship. Bellowing, he proclaimed, "For every man they kill, he will reward the brave warrior a gold coin." Hearing this, the sailors' courage surged back. Confident they wouldn't be rammed, the hawk-headed ship left the safety of the riverbank, progressing alongside the Roland. Soon, they were about to overtake the Roland, and the distance between the two vessels narrowed to a mere few meters.
The sailors brandished an assortment of weapons, readying for an initial onslaught. Aboard, men aimed at Roland with a variety of weapons, including bows and arrows and the latest firearms bestowed by Timothy.
However, they inflicted no damage. As they were about to climb up to the Roland, the deck of the Roland appeared deserted, but Eden spotted a long barrel surrounded by metal, with small holes exposed at the center.
Before the crew could even make any move, flames burst forth from the barrels. Sailors dropped like harvested wheat.
Those who reacted sought cover, but no hiding spot could shield them from this terrifying weapons assault.
Bodies littered the ship, bullets penetrating their bodies.
Even the mast, under the relentless assault of this fearsome weaponry, could not withstand, and with a creaking noise, it broke in two. The glory Eden hoped for never happened. He realized they faced a type of firearm, with an extraordinarily rapid rate of fire. He couldn't fathom how, in the hands of the rebel prince, a weapon known for slow reloading and imprecise aim became so devastatingly effective.
Why were the weapons Timothy gave them so inferior and useless? Unfortunately, he didn't get any answers. Soon, a rain of bullets enveloped him. The last ship lay paralyzed in the center of the river, signaling the end of the battle. The air was filled with the enemy's moans and cries of pain. Those who survived had lost all will to fight, swimming towards the riverbank. The artillery battalion was somewhat disappointed, having missed the chance to showcase their latest cannons to the rifle battalion. As everyone placed the cannonballs back into their boxes, someone remarked that compared to the ammunition consumed by the machine guns just now, a single cannonball wasn't much more expensive or troublesome. Vayner frowned. These were handcrafted by Miss Anna herself. How can he compare them to the machine gun bullets they can produce by the hundreds daily? He instructed his men to aim carefully during the later siege, telling them to not ruin the reputation of the artillery battalion. Someone boasted, he promised to blast open the royal capital's city gates in 3 shots or less. All eyes turned to Rodney, expecting him to chip in. Cleaning his gun, Rodney mused, he wishes he had a ship like this as well. His eyes sparkled as he repeated, he wishes he had a ship named the Rodney. Hearing this, Rodney's older brother stepped forward. Shouldn't that honor be his first? As Rodney's elder brother? Rodney chuckled, he won't give this opportunity away to anyone. Vayner joined in, the second ship could only be named the Vayner. Catclaw then asked, what about the Catclaw? Staring at Catclaw. In unison, everyone responded, no way. Amid the light-hearted banter, the fleet set sail once more, heading towards the royal capital. 2 days later, they arrived at the royal capital, with its walls now visible in the distance. Lightning, responsible for scouting, reported, a troop is stationed at the dock ahead, roughly 100 men, not heavily armed. Roland was slightly taken aback. It wasn't surprising that Timothy had defenses set up at the suburban docks. Surely, Timothy must have received news of their fleet through the carrier pigeons. However, the fact that only 100 men were positioned at the dock was unexpected.
Roland had assumed that Timothy would have archers and firearms positioned along both riverbanks and might even have set up trebuchets to intercept their landing. It seemed Timothy had given up on the advantage of attacking them mid-crossing.
Could Timothy possibly know the range and power of his 152mm naval cannon?
Shaking his head, Roland thought it unlikely.
He then turned to Sylvie, asking if she could spot the militia carrying the church's pills. Sylvie used her magic eyes for observation. She didn't see any pills. Most don't even have weapons. However, there's something strange underground. They've buried some things, clay pots and wooden barrels filled with a black-gray powder. Nightingale instantly thought of gunpowder. Roland then realized Timothy's strategy. The group of around 100 men was merely bait sent by Timothy to divert their attention. Their real intention was to wait for Roland to approach the deck and disembark, then set off the gunpowder. The dock was the essential path, and Timothy clearly recognized this fact. However, instead of mounting a direct defense, he opted for a hidden ambush, trying to catch them off guard. If not for Sylvie, they might have fallen straight into the trap. Now that they've discovered it in advance, the solution seemed relatively simple. Without wireless detonation capabilities, Timothy would undoubtedly have stationed personnel nearby to ignite the gunpowder. All they needed to do was neutralize them beforehand. Either way, they had to secure the dock, or it would be challenging to get the artillery and ammunition onto land. Roland asked Sylvie to help him identify the ignition points.
He then instructed Nightingale to infiltrate, locate, and eliminate the individuals set to light the gunpowder and secure the area, preventing any potential backups from igniting the explosives.
Leaning against the battlement of the western wall of the royal capital, a knight peered through his binoculars, monitoring the canal's activity. He had spotted Roland's fleet. He hadn't expected Roland to truly dare launch an attack on the royal capital. Chuckling, he mused, ever since the construction over 200 years ago, this royal capital city has never faced an assault. Any adversary, upon seeing its majestic tall stone walls, would lose the courage to attack. But he had to admit he admired Roland. No one else dared to challenge their enemy at their most formidable point. It's a pity that Roland was an adversary. But being a knight of the royal capital, he had a duty to protect it at all costs. A soldier rushed up to report, "The rebel prince's fleet has arrived." The knight set down his binoculars, remarking he was already aware. He then issued orders, 1st and 2nd cavalry squads, mount up and stand by behind the city gates. As for those mercenaries, just have them follow the cavalry closely. Ensure everyone readies the city's defense weapons. Also, get the oil pots heated. Although he didn't think Roland would come close to the city walls, it didn't hurt to be prepared. He jestingly warned his subordinates not to wet themselves when the gunpowder explodes, causing a round of hearty laughter among the surrounding knights. According to the plan, once the rebel troops occupied the dock, flags would be raised from the city walls. At that signal, a high explosive snow powder buried near the dock would be detonated, undoubtedly causing heavy losses and chaos within the enemy's ranks. Following that, the city gates would be opened, and a cavalry charge would seal their victory. He raised his binoculars once again, puzzled about how a ship without paddles and sails could move. Nonetheless, he deemed it irrelevant. Regardless of how unusual a vessel might be, it couldn't march on land. The strange ship gradually slowed down and eventually came to a halt opposite the dock. Another knight also lifted his binoculars, jesting, "Could it be that the mere 100-man militia has scared the rebel prince?" As the others looked on in confusion and the knight was about to say more, a burst of flame suddenly ignited from the front end of the ship. Only moments after the flash of fire did they hear a muffled boom. It had precisely exploded near the wooden hut meant to ignite the explosive powder. From such a distance, they couldn't understand how they were being attacked, but the knight suddenly realized, could the enemy have known about the snow powder buried at the dock? Information gathered from various sources indicated that the rebel prince possessed incredibly powerful weapons. Their range and accuracy far surpassed the iron tubes forged by the blacksmiths of the royal capital.
Therefore, from the very beginning, Timothy has decided not to confront them head-on but instead set up an ambush with explosive barrels of snow powder, rendering Roland's weapons useless. Soon, a second warehouse was blown up. With this, Timothy's ambush plan was rendered completely fail. At that moment, a loud explosion echoed from the city walls. Countless amounts of soil and rocks were thrown into the air as all the snow powder buried in the ground was ignited. The knight cursed furiously, "Who is the fool who ignited all the snow powder without waiting for the signal?" The dock was turned into a mess of craters and pits, with countless militiamen and knights killed or injured. The knight ordered his subordinates to raise the blue flag. Suddenly, another massive sound resonated, causing the entire city wall to shake. This time, the anomaly was the city gate. A large gap appeared in the massive gate, and yet the enemy was still miles away. Someone shouted, "It's the demons have come." The scene, already chaotic, erupted into pure pandemonium. The previously prepared cavalry turned their horses around in retreat, and the mercenaries in the back began to flee as well. The leading knight was still trying to control the situation, but the thick smoke and the smell of blood prevented him from uttering any commands. At the same time, a hot air balloon approached above the city walls. Wendy pulled a lever, releasing a bomb from its bracket, which plummeted to the ground. Lightning effortlessly caught up with the bomb, guiding it straight to the city wall. As it descended, the young girl saw the horrified expressions of the knights on the wall. The bomb struck the wall with a massive explosion, creating a huge gap. Those nearby were instantly consumed by the ensuing flames. The previously prepared hot oil splattered everywhere, falling onto the soldiers guarding the city walls. Moments before, the knights who had been preparing for battle were now scattered and fleeing in panic. Many lost their way in the thick smoke and fell off the wall, others writhed and rolled on the ground, trying to put out the flames engulfing them. Looking at the smoking city wall of the royal capital, Sylvie's face showed a hint of reluctance. She slowly said, "Their defense has collapsed." Nightingale, expressionless, said, "They got what they deserved. If they had won, they would only become more ruthless." Roland took a deep breath, saying, "Either way, someone has to pay the price for this conflict. If not the enemy, then it will be them." He didn't want to lament the cruelty of war at this moment or cherish the value of peace. It was a struggle for power, a battle for survival, and a clash of ideologies. Soon, the horn for the final assault echoed over the dock area. The First Army, fully armed, led by Axe, prepared for the last push. Amidst the smoky city walls, the First Army quickly broke through the main gate. Their target was to seize the royal palace gates. Once inside the inner city, the pace of their advance abruptly slowed. Here, they met a powerful counterattack from the enemy. Members of the First Army were continuously injured, and those hurt were immediately pulled to the rear by their comrades, waiting for Nanawa's medical assistance. Field guns couldn't be brought forward due to various obstacles on the path, but they had no time to think about alternatives. The fully armored knights, boosted by the church's berserk pills, charged wave after wave. A burst of gunfire sounded, and the berserk knights at the front were riddled with bullets and fell, but the ones behind continued their charge undeterred. Even when shot in the arm or torso, their speed didn't decrease. The squad captain, after dispatching the enemies in the front, began to issue the next set of orders. However, their enemies weren't just attacking from the front. Suddenly, a group of berserk knights leaped from the residential houses on the side streets, smashing through the windows. Before the soldiers could turn their weapons, the berserk knights had already started attacking them. One of the First Army soldiers was cleaved in half by a knight whose eyes glowed a fierce red. The squad quickly killed the knight, but more were pouring out of the houses. The formation of the soldiers was disrupted, leading to close-quarter combat. Continuous screams and shouts of pain filled the air, and the First Army soldiers were injured one after another. Although terrified, their training kept reminding them that only by sticking together and utilizing their collective strength could they possibly survive in the face of such powerful enemies. They kept pulling their triggers, gradually reforming their formation. At that moment, reinforcements arrived. The artillery battalion had encountered trouble on East Street, but the heavy machine gun unit had come to their aid. The squad leader yelled to make way for the heavy machine gun. The Maxim heavy machine gun was dragged onto the street by the reinforcements, and after setting up in a firing position, it unleashed a hail of bullets onto the Berserk Knights, launching another wave of assault. The dense stream of bullets formed an invisible wall, halting the Berserk Knights in their tracks. Together with the First Army soldiers, the Berserk Knights were taken down one by one. By the time the gunfire ceased, white smoke was billowing from the barrels of the guns. The ground was littered with the bodies of the Berserk Knights. Those who were shot but not instantly killed writhed on the ground, groaning in pain and agony. The Berserk Knights continued their relentless attacks on the soldiers of the First Army, even on the floor. Remembering their fallen comrade, the squad showed no hesitation and swiftly ended the enemy. Once the path was cleared, the First Army was able to advance once more. Different units and squads began to converge from various directions. As a hot air balloon loomed over the royal palace, more bombs obliterated the garden wall and iron gate. The final assault had begun. Inside the palace, Timothy sat on his bed. His royal guard rushed in, urgently informing him that the enemy was at the palace gates, hinting at a hasty retreat. Timothy sat silently, contemplating his next move. The very room brought back memories of his father's tragic end, and now, it seemed history was about to repeat itself. Writing on the death of Wimbledon III, Timothy had cunningly shifted the blame onto the elder prince, Gerald, eliminating the major threat and ascending to the pinnacle of power. In the span of a year, he had managed to consolidate the eastern and northern territories, also forcing his younger sister, Garcia, into exile. His influence seemed unmatched. He had believed that the western territory would inevitably be his, and uniting the entirety of Greycastle was just a matter of time. Yet, he had not anticipated the sudden and swift turn of events. In merely 3 days, his world had crumbled, leaving him with nothing. Timothy furiously slammed a candlestick from the bedside table onto the floor, venting his anger. He shouted furiously, "This is all witchcraft! If not for the witches and demons, how could Roland's weapon be so powerful?" His voice was strained, filled with rage, and a slight tremor. "The church is useless. They claim to hunt witches, yet they missed Roland Wimbledon. If it wasn't for witches, how could Roland's weapons be far superior to his? No matter the wealth, labor, or territory and resources, Timothy's advantage is hundreds of times greater than Roland's. There's only one explanation: the demon is helping Roland." The constant explosions and clashing of swords outside momentarily calmed Timothy. He couldn't die now, he needed to seek revenge. Looking at his guard, he ordered, "Into the secret tunnel." The knight escorted Timothy into the hidden passage, which was known to have a dead gate. Once the dead gate was activated, the entrance would be sealed forever, blocking any potential pursuit. The passage was filled with traps and stones of God punishment. Timothy was sure Roland would be clueless about this place. In the secret tunnel, Timothy pondered his next step. He needed the support of the loyal nobles and dukes. Although uncertain of their loyalty after Greycastle's fall, he knew he needed to give it a try. Or perhaps, he should seek refuge with the church? If the church could help him in avenging his loss, so what if he handed the Grey Castle over? The thought consumed him, rapidly growing stronger and more intense with each passing moment. If he could personally send Roland to the guillotine and torment every one of Roland's witches, everything would be worth it. In the dim light of the torches, Timothy made up his mind. He and his guards chose the longest tunnel and made their way out of the royal capital. However, as they emerged from the secret tunnel, they found themselves surrounded, rifles pointed directly at them. For a moment, despair washed over Timothy. The soldiers of the First Army stood at the city gates, welcoming their king Roland. The battle had raged on from yesterday and only ended early morning. After breaching the gates, the First Army took control of the inner city's royal palace and the Grand Cathedral in the eastern district. What followed was mopping up the remnants of the enemy, utterly extinguishing the resistance forces of Timothy. Brian, with palpable excitement, reported, "Your Majesty, the path to the palace has been cleared.
The city is now yours."
Roland glanced around and saw the same fervor mirrored on everyone's faces. Whether it was the soldiers of the First Army or the witches, their high spirits seemed almost overwhelming. However, contrary to expectations, Roland felt surprisingly calm. The magnificent capital representing the heart of Grey Castle did not resonate with him, nor did he feel like he had returned home. To Roland, this was just another city. All around the inner city were the sites of damaged buildings. Undoubtedly, this was the process of seizing the palace, although brief, was the most intense battle the First Army had ever encountered. Looking at the ruins lining the streets, a pang of distress hit Roland. The exact casualties had yet to be tallied, but the bodies of over 20 soldiers from the First Army had already been sent to the rear.
This number would have been at least tripled if not for the timely rescue efforts of manhwa.
As they entered the palace grounds, the station soldiers went down on one knee, a rare sight in the First Army, where military salutes were more common.
Roland did not voice any objections.
From their uplifted expressions, it was clear that they weren't welcoming him as leader of the army but were paying respects as citizens of Grey Castle to their new king. The soldiers raised their weapons in unison, shouting, "Long life King Roland!" Amidst the cheers of the First Army, Roland advanced towards the palace.
Stepping into the grand twin-towered palace.
This place symbolized the supreme authority of the Grey Castle royal family. Within the grand hall, apart from the soldiers holding their weapons at the ready, there was a group of visibly anxious nobles and ministers.
Upon seeing Roland, they all knelt in unison, collectively welcoming his arrival.
Among these nobles, he recognized several familiar faces: the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Justice, the Chief of Intelligence Officer, and the Prime Minister, among others. These individuals had once served King Wimbledon III.
Some of their lineages could even be traced back to the very inception of the Wimbledon dynasty.
When Timothy ascended the throne, they had all pledged their loyalty to the new king. Now, they seemed ready to do the same for Roland, in keeping with tradition.
Unfortunately, Roland didn't need any of them.
This wasn't a court discussion, it was a trial.
Roland took his place on the throne, looking down upon them all. He motioned for them to rise. He then announced that Timothy was under arrest for the suspected assassination of Prince Gerald, for treason, and for colluding with the church. His crimes would be announced throughout the city and the entire kingdom. He then asked the ministers if they had anything to say.
One of the nobles was the first to respond, stating that such crimes were unforgivable. He claimed to have once tried to dissuade Timothy but to no avail. The other nobles nodded in agreement.
Roland sneered and asked, "Is that truly the case? When Timothy was committing such heinous acts, was he merely a bystander, or was he aiding his tyranny?"
Another older minister spoke up. After Timothy ascended to the throne, he promoted a large number of his loyalists. Whether it was deploying the knights or conscripting troops, it was beyond their control from the old ministers like them. Several other nobles and ministers chimed in, adding that when Gerald was sent to the guillotine, it bypassed the judicial court, and the executioners were the knights. They were powerless to stop them.
Roland's opinion of these ministers dipped even further. Perhaps during the founding of Grey Castle, these noble ministers were indeed the king's valuable aides.
However, over the centuries, they had become utterly rigid and corrupt. Standing up, Roland declared, if they claim that all the events of the past year had nothing to do with them, then they should play a game. The gathered nobles exchanged puzzled glances, not understanding Roland's intentions. Roland swept his gaze over the gathered nobility, introducing a game called Question and Answer, also known as the trial game. The rule was simple: tell a lie, and they're out. Roland told everyone that each person only gets one chance. The crowd swallowed nervously. Before anyone could utter another word, Roland casually mentioned that those who were out could face punishment such as the gallows, labor in the mines, confiscation of their assets, or exile. The ministers started to panic, with some even accusing Roland of treating this as some childish game. A few even thought of leaving.
But Roland wasn't seeking their opinions. He approached Duke Wick and asked if he had participated when Timothy had forced the refugees to attack the Western territories. The Duke Wick, after a brief moment of silence and lowering his head, admitted he had followed Timothy's orders to recruit refugees from the eastern and southern regions. However, he claimed unaware of the latter half of Roland's statement. Roland felt a slight pinch on his right shoulder, a sign of lying. He coldly gazed at the Duke Wick. Stated that he was lying. Even as Duke Wick tried to correct himself, 2 soldiers from the First Army had already dragged him away. The hall fell silent, with no one daring to speak. Roland hoped for honesty, for he could discern lies. Hearing this, the ministers and nobles fell to their knees, confessing their sins and begging for Roland's mercy. As Roland had anticipated, this was a trial. He posed many questions, and by the end, the ministers and nobles had confessed their crimes and sins from the past year. One noble even confessed that his steward had slept with his wife while he was away hunting, and in retaliation, he had the steward castrated without a formal trial. Roland was momentarily taken aback, thinking, what kind of confessions are these? In the end, some were imprisoned, and others were let go. Roland stood and instructed everyone to leave for now. He would begin the process of restructuring the family order and would notify them later. But he warned them, this game would not be a one-time event. After spending an entire day addressing those issues, it was time to meet Timothy. Axe and Nightingale accompanied Roland as they headed to the basement dungeon where Timothy was confined. As they approached Timothy's cell, it was evident that he was not in the best mental state. However, the moment he saw Roland, he asked, "Who are you really?" His parched voice echoed throughout the dungeon, revealing a mixture of clear, discernible emotions. Roland wasn't surprised by the question. Compared to Tilly, with whom he had limited interactions, Timothy was more familiar with the Fourth Prince. After all, the Fourth Prince's erratic and volatile personality was, to a significant extent, a direct result of Timothy's own actions. Roland looked at Timothy and calmly replied, "He is Roland Wimbledon." "Don't Timothy recognize him?" Timothy responded shakily, "This is not Roland." Roland could never look straight in the eye at him. Roland would never dare to confront him directly. Roland shook his head, recounting an incident from their childhood when he was 12. Timothy, along with Gerald and Garcia, had invited Roland to explore the palace basement. They then stole a key from a guard and locked Roland in one of these cells. The plan was to come back the next morning to laugh at his misfortune, leaving afterward in a fit of laughter. In that pitch-black room, the young Fourth Prince was so terrified that he shivered uncontrollably, not even daring to shout out loud. In the end, he curled up in a corner, burying his head in his knees, sobbing softly. By the time the trio came to mock him the next morning, his face was smeared with tears and snot. Back then, he didn't even have the courage to face Timothy head-on. The two of them stared at each other in silence for a long time until Timothy, unable to bear it any longer, finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Roland is a demon who has taken Roland's body to steal his kingdom." Roland didn't bother to explain himself. Instead, he retorted, "Are the deeds Timothy committed any less demonic than those of a demon? Killing their own father, pinning the conspiracy on their brother, and then executing him. To hold on to the throne Timothy seized, Timothy not only allied with the church, which their father despised, but also forcibly conscripted innocent civilians to attack the Garcia's territory. Even the most weakest and inept Fourth Prince wasn't spared by Timothy. Within just a year, the kingdom is in shambles, with numerous cities ruined by war and refugees scattered everywhere. Perhaps even a demon couldn't have achieved such chaos." Timothy, in a state of panic, tried to defend himself, yelling that he didn't kill their father, saying their father committed suicide. Just like Roland, their father was possessed by a demon. Upon hearing this, Roland furrowed his brow. Timothy, gripping the iron bars tightly, insisted he was not lying. Their father was lying in bed as he usually did, and then he just smiled before stabbing himself with a dagger. At that very moment, their father was also wearing the stone of God punishment. Everything unfolded so suddenly that Timothy